Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Seche, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Arab Gulf States Institute for this discussion today on Yemen. Although we're not going to focus specifically on the conflict that continues between the Saudi-led coalition and the rebel Houthis, but certainly that conflict and the enormous humanitarian dimensions of that conflict are very much on our mind today and very much drive the focus of our conversation. But that focus is going to be on just what lies just over the horizon, if you will, on what we think and we imagine might happen the day after the conflict debates. And then the international community and the NGO community and whatever government emerges in Yemen and the Yemeni people themselves really have to address the issue of how do we now tackle these enormous humanitarian challenges and the challenge also of beginning the physical reconstruction and the political reconciliation that's going to be such an urgent need for Yemen as it goes forward. So our focus today will be on what must be put in place to ensure that the human, physical, and financial resources can be brought to bear in an effective and timely manner in Yemen to address the post-conflict requirements. How it will be mobilized, distributed, and monitored effectively. And we'll examine what all interested parties can do and maybe should be doing even now in order to prepare themselves and Yemen itself for this opportunity and this challenge that lies ahead. Joining me today for this discussion are three individuals that I think probably have experience and insight into Yemen that's unparalleled. And I will introduce them to you now, and I apologize in advance for compressing their very impressive CVs, but if I were to do the entire summary of their experience, I'd be here all day describing what they've done, and we'd have no time for our discussion. So with that in mind, to my immediate left is Alsoswa, a former UN Assistant Secretary General and former Director of the Regional Bureau of Arab States in the UN Development Program. Next is Les Campbell, the Director of Middle East and North Africa Programs at the National Democratic Institute. And to my far left is Fatima Alasrar, an independent policy analyst whose fieldwork focuses on conflict management. So what I'd like to do to start our discussion today is take a look at and establish, if we can, to what extent the key realities in Yemen are beginning to be felt, and what we can calculate them to be, what needs to be addressed, and what are some of the resources perhaps on the ground that need to be developed in order to assure that they can be addressed at some point. And I think what we're going to begin with is Fatima will look at some of the conflicts because our focus is often just on the Houthi-Saudi coalition conflict. But there are multiple conflicts now, and partly it's because of this larger conflict, others have ensued. But I think identifying them and knowing to what extent they will be factors in a stabilization effort is going to be an essential part of that. And so I'm going to turn this over to Fatima now to begin our discussion. Please, Fatima.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for having me here. I'd like to thank the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. I'm really pleased to be among really distinguished members of the panel, Ms. Amatalalim and Les, probably the third time this year. I was asked to touch on the humanitarian aspect in Yemen and the suffering and the aid delivery, what can be done there, what is the supportive infrastructure that exists there in Yemen, and how can we lessen from the impact of the fighting. But I don't know how much background you have on Yemen, and I think it's probably, if you listen to the mainstream media, there's probably not much holistic information. It's very much reported in terms of black and white type of picture. So I thought I'll delve in a little bit and provide a context that maybe could be useful in understanding the types of conflicts that are in Yemen at the moment and the drivers of conflict, because these affect our trajectories for peace and aid delivery as well. And so first, the current Arab intervention in Yemen, which started in March this year, was mostly solicited by the current government of the transitional government of President Hadi, because he was unable to enforce his sovereignty and control over the Houthi political group's ambition in the country. The Houthis have self-governed Sada, their governorate, for a very long time, and they felt that they could further venture into further areas in Yemen and do the same. And this is where it became a red line. However, the Yemeni government did not have the capacity to respond to that. And as a result, it solicited this intervention from the Arab community, which unfortunately had devastating effects on the country and ended up targeting more of civilians rather than the Houthi militias. There are about almost roughly 2,000 people who were killed. Since the OSHA estimates, which is the Office of Humanitarian Coordination and Assistance for the UN, is about 30 people dying every day and about 158 injured on a daily basis. But so far, the conflict has been framed as Houthis against the government, and Houthis and also the former President Saleh's militia and supporters, both working together against the government, against the Arab coalition. And this is in part correct, but also it sort of disregards other types of conflicts that are there in Yemen at the moment. The Houthi advancement was mostly infuriating because it happened on the back of the National Dialogue Conference, which was supposed to bring people together. It actually provided the opportunity and the platform for people to come and express their grievances, and they did. However, they had this zero-sum approach to governance and to power, and they wanted to just rule by thinking that they will take it all and take Yemen, all of it. But this unfortunately has led to the current crisis. But the understanding of the other type of crisis that occurred in Yemen, including this one, I think is going to be helpful in terms of understanding what type of response that is needed for aid and for peace building, and how we can focus on what's going forward once the violence stops. But I think one of the problems that we always do is we talk about peace building when there is no peacemaking, and right now there is no peacemaking. We did not get an agreement yet, but this is, let's say, a pre roadmap of considerations of what needs to be happening on the ground in Yemen. And so in talking about conflict in Yemen, I would say that there are three layers of conflict. The first is what I would like to call as thematic conflict, or resource conflict, which is often centered around water issues, land issues, oil and gas quarrels between some tribes, revenge killings, somewhat a little bit political motivated. These types of conflicts have existed for a very long time. They affect a big segment of the population. I would say probably around 60 to 70%, roughly. But they're resolved through traditional mechanisms of local government and justice. So it's very much considered small stuff. It's small news. It doesn't even make it doesn't make it to the local Yemeni newspaper. But it's at the same time, these types of provincial conflicts do require a significant amount of aid and resources. And for the past couple of decades, international organizations, the government, have worked on a plan to deliver aid to these areas that have been marginalized and needed aid in order to stop from these types of conflict. The second type of conflict is what I would call identity conflict, and this is fixed. It has relatively fixed actors on each side. It has clear geographical boundaries, so you could define it in the Houthis up in the north and the Hirak down in the south. And it has also some phases where it ebbs and flows. So these conflicts have legitimate political grievances that has been recognized by the government of Yemen, by the people of Yemen. However, these types of grievances rose relatively recently, probably in the past couple of decades. So, of course, the southern issue was immediately after unification and the civil war, and the Houthis was around, the time frame was around 2003, 2004. Yemen did not have a good experience in dealing and responding to these conflicts. But this type of conflict needs reforms. It needs reforms in political institutions, and this is where the focus needs to be in the justice sector, in providing equality for all, making Yemeni citizens take their rights fully without any discrimination. So. And the donor community has somewhat given scant assistance in this domain, and not so much focused on it. The third type of conflict is extremely recent, and it's devastating. It has a very disruptive impact, and it doesn't allow for aid or delivery assistance. And I would call this conflict imported conflict because it has absolutely nothing to do with Yemen or with the ways that Yemenis live their lives. And it's an import of violent extremism, which has trickled down from countries in the region, and Yemen has served as a good host for these environments because of the lack of rule of law and security. These types of conflict are almost impossible to deal with because there are no development programs that are conditioned to deal with Al-Qaeda or to help out in mediation efforts in these groups. But the way to circumvent Al-Qaeda from thriving in Yemen is by providing a stable economic environment, a stable and prosperous opportunities for citizens where they will have more of an opportunity to a better chance of life that will not allow them to engage with Al-Qaeda in a sense. So just having a strong rule of law, a strong a sense of economic well-being, these could be factors that would lessen from the impact of terrorist groups. So on the outset, these are really some devastating issues. I think Yemen will have to deal with, or in terms of dealing with the assistance, we'd have to consider all of these factors and all of these conflicts, and not just one conflict specifically. I have spoken to a number of organizations about the aid delivery that is going on in Yemen. Certainly, there's a flash appeal that has been out for or has been issued about 5 or 6 months ago. The Saudi government has promised to fund the flash appeal completely. However, there are, as I understand, problems in delivery. The money has not been delivered yet. And the problem with that as well is that the Saudis are attaching their conditionality on that. And there isn't really much information in terms of what type of conditionality is attached to dispersing the money. And I particularly worry about this because there's a culture of democracy in Yemen that is not necessarily typical or not necessarily in line with the ones in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf. One of the things that come to my mind, for example, despite the fact that Yemen being one of the poorest countries in the Arabian Peninsula, it's one of the richest in terms of its democratic heritage, civil society participation, and media and women empowerment as well. Exactly. So this is not existent in Saudi Arabia, and this makes me somewhat worry about the future of where we're going to be. Are we going to build on the former existing efforts, or are we starting new with something that we don't know where it's going to go exactly? So the other thing that worries me is that because this is an Arab intervention, that largely the response to it by other donors who have helped Yemen in the past will be like, okay, well, it's an Arab problem and the funding should be should be coming from just Arab sources, because they have been engaged so far in this military activity. And I think this is also a dangerous type of thinking. I know, for example, when the Saudis funded the flash appeal, no one else put any money in it. And I think it's important that the Western donors, put almost the same amount of assistance for Yemen on the long term and work on all the fronts. So the humanitarian issue, the peace building issues, but also on the political institutions and democracy and peace building, because that is extremely important.
Stop there for
yes.
a second so I can move on to Les.
Sure.
And we'll get back to you shortly.
Sure.
I think you've raised some interesting points. But I think the sense they deliver of what they see as the essentials for security and also the obstacles to that reveal to some extent their perceptions, too, of conflicts that exist in the country. And Les, I'll let you describe that for us in greater detail, please.
Thank you. And I'll echo what Fatima said about it being a pleasure to be here. And we really all are friends and go back many, many years, probably better times in the past. But I just before I started, echo what Fatima said and Amat was saying as well, which is that despite the crisis and despite how terrible everything seems, there really is something special about Yemen, special about Yemenis, where you know that if the moment occurs, which it will, that people can work together, that there are all these strengths, there is diversity. There certainly is the will to work together, and we're caught in this terrible conflict, and it's really a matter of finding a way to create that moment where people can remember that they want to come together. And I say that as a preface to what I'll talk about, which is that we at NDI work with the National Democratic Institute. We were feeling very frustrated at not being able to have a role. It's very difficult. We've typically been engaged in political discussions with politicians, political parties, political actors of various sorts, civil society, bringing the civil society people in to talk with politicians. And this was a very hands-on process. It was done in the country. It was done through a lot of meetings and interactions and traveling around the country. We have an office in Aden as well and some staff there, and we've kind of utilized very long-serving senior staff members over the course of around 20 years now, roughly 20 years. A little more we've been involved actually than 20 years. And so we were sort of accustomed to having a role in either bringing people together, or if people were together, kind of facilitating conversations and trying to steer toward political resolutions to problems that would otherwise cause conflict. And it has been horribly frustrating to be on the sidelines, because that kind of work really can't be done in a conflict situation. And the longer the conflict goes on, the more difficult it is, obviously, because it really is a matter of you have to have a powerful force, basically the international community through the UN or through others have to be able to bring the warring parties together. So we couldn't do that and couldn't be involved in that. But we started to think of ways that we could continue the conversation with involved Yemenis. And several of our senior staff members are residing abroad right now, as many Yemenis are, in Jordan, in Beirut. And so we got the idea of working with a variety of sources, including the embassies in country, to find as many Yemenis that are temporarily residing abroad, in this case Jordan and Lebanon, and then choosing out of that pool, choosing people randomly, breaking into groups of men and women, and organizing focus groups as methodologically soundly as we could under the circumstances, and using our senior staff who have all been trained as focus group moderators to hold discussions with Yemenis residing abroad. We'll probably continue this in the future, but it worked out really well, and probably most of you that follow Yemen won't be surprised to find out that people were very, very eager to participate. And right from the second it started, they had opinions and they were expressing them and are very engaged. So even though they're living abroad right now, it's only purely out of very important safety reasons and so on. I think they'd all go back in a second if they could. So I thought I'll just quickly run through some of the kind of main observations of these focus groups, because in the absence of the kind of information that all of us could normally get. I mean, Ambassador Seche could at one point in time sit down with important Yemenis and kind of shoot the breeze, basically, but we can't really do that anymore. So this is at least a source of information. And it's a different source than going to Riyadh and talking to the government in exile, and it's a different source than the media. These are much more ordinary people. Probably, they probably skew maybe toward the elite because they had the resources to get out of the country, but they're not, they're not involved in the current problem. So just some highlights and some things that struck me as interesting. Just on this question of sectarian divisions, one woman has a really interesting quote, said that growing up she was never aware that there were any sectarian divisions in Yemen. She said, we don't have Sunni and Shia. Never before had she heard a media report saying a Shia mosque was targeted in Sana'a, and she said she wouldn't even know what a Shia mosque was. So, she was saying this has become new to her, which I thought was interesting. And all groups identified the economic consequences of the conflict, and they talked about how negative it was about the departure of business people and their fortunes and their dollars. And I think they were probably even thinking of people like themselves that had to, pull significant financial resources out of the country. And they all found it troubling that the current situation was providing more opportunities for terrorist groups to operate and to recruit vulnerable Yemeni youth. Although they all thought there were multiple entities responsible for the current conflict, they all felt that most of the blame should be attributed to Ali Abdullah Saleh. So he was the whipping boy for these groups. And one participant said that without him, there would be no Abdul Malik al-Houthi to contend with, that they feel that he kind of elevated the Houthis to this position where they could take over the country. But most politicians did not escape from criticism in terms of the person who they think has diminished the most in the eyes of participants. Overwhelmingly, they thought President Hadi, that all four groups, and there were four groups, I should have mentioned that, a group of men, group of women, I think that, right, Zach, in each country, so four groups altogether. They all had developed negative attitudes toward Hadi, felt that he let them down, failed to protect Yemen, and that he had betrayed the trust that people had invested in President Hadi. So very few leaders come out unscathed here. A lot of anger towards Saudi Arabia and suspicion about their agenda. Well, everyone agreed that Saudi Arabia had some kind of agenda. Several people said something along the lines of, but it's an evil that needs to exist, in the sense that Saudi Arabia is or has the ability to destroy the Houthi weapons. So suspicion of Saudi Arabia, but kind of an acceptance that under the circumstances that they have to live with this. So those were sort of overall themes that came through. Participants all struggled to identify leaders that they trust. Prime Minister and Vice President Baha received a vote of confidence from, particularly in Lebanon. I don't know if there was a difference. Some of you may know why Lebanon participants are different than Jordanian participants, but in Lebanon, they like Baha, not so much in Jordan. But he's still acceptable. I think there's still some goodwill toward him. But I think what people did note is that it's only a matter of time before the old guard, quote, political elites who brought Yemen to this current crisis would be back in power. And I think maybe they perceive Baha as some kind of outgrowth of that. I personally see him as younger, more technocratic, but I'm not sure how they see him. But I quote, "Those who are fighting today are the ones who participated in the national dialogue." So I guess they're just not buying the idea that the gang that is out there are the ones that can resolve this. People did name a whole group of individuals that they had respect for. I won't name all the names. I'll share this with my Yemeni colleagues here later. You can have this, and they'll know some of the names. I don't know them all. But what in the group of people that they named, as we understand it, what kind of sets them apart is that they're people calling for peace without taking the sides of either warring party. So it seems that people respect the leaders who are able to maintain neutrality is probably not the right word, but who are less partisan in their outlook and in their discourse. So people are looking for solutions rather than, I guess, people trying to continue to throw fuel on the fire. Most participants thought that youth and women could be main drivers of stability and should be involved in participating, and they all believe strongly that there should be new emerging voices. People agreed that a future political process should be inclusive, and even though they're negative about a lot of the traditional political leaders, they do think that that all political parties need to be at the table, along with all warring parties, with the caveat that a condition of participation would be disarmament of these parties and a desire to participate in the political process as opposed to using violence as a means of achieving their goals. So in other words, what they're saying is everyone should be at the table, and they talked about the UN resolution later on, but I think to paraphrase this or to kind of read something into this, they're saying that you have to give up on the armed conflict as a way of achieving your aims before you go to the table. And this is always a problem in ending the conflict because the warring sides typically want to hedge their bets. They want to be at the table, but they don't want to give up, their option B. So this is, and this, probably in the end is the big problem right now. No one's quite willing to give up option A, which is fighting, for option B, which is very unknown. So they did talk about UN Resolution 2216 and felt it should be implemented. I'm not going to get too much into that because it's very complex in terms of the negotiations. There is not a lot of trust in the UN. I won't dwell on that too much, but it's not just because of the process now, but feeling that perhaps the national dialogue process was not as well handled as it should be. So I don't think the UN is kind of fatally wounded in this, but it's not perhaps as respected as it should be. So people, not surprising, being Yemenis, because they're very engaged, they have all sorts of ideas on how to end this. So disarm militias, continue dialogue and discussion, have a political resolution, try to get more consistency and accuracy in media reporting. Everyone had media as a big problem because they're living abroad, I guess, and they don't get accurate information, which no one does. Ending outside interventions, which is what Fatima was talking about with all the outside interference, the return of the state and its mechanisms and the functioning of the state, and then preventing religious control over the state, which I think is a danger from a variety of sources. They still know about the NDC and still think that the National Dialogue Conference and its outcomes are relevant. And they think it was an important process, that it should not be thrown away. It was discussed without much prompting. But they did feel that some of the major outcomes, and particularly the whole issue of regionalism, federalism, should be revisited, and the six region model, which came out of the NDC, should probably be reevaluated and amended, which is pretty obvious since I don't think there'll be six regions coming out of this. But some other people had different ideas. They thought that you start by dealing with the issue of the South and Sada. In other words, you sort of get the North and the South right now settled so that they stop fighting and that the South is kind of on firm ground, and then you form a government of competencies or some kind of technocratic government. I've heard, putting aside the focus groups, I was just in Lebanon myself and met with a few other political leader type Yemenis that were there who are more kind of engaged in this process, and they had different ideas. Everyone's thinking of slight variations, but everyone I think believes it's fair to say, including political leaders, that the first step is to form a government or governments, perhaps a government in the South, maybe a government in the North, that can bring security and some semblance of normal everyday life, and that then this can be perhaps somehow coordinated by some kind of technocratic coordinating structure. So it's interesting, even though everyone had slightly different ideas, this basic idea of providing, getting daily life back to normal in North and South, and then finding some way of coordinating and, stitching it back together would be something you do down the road. Nobody saw, and by this, maybe this will surprise you coming from NDI, where we work a lot on elections, no one saw the rush to elections as an answer to the current crisis, and I think they're right about that.
They're not going to put you out of work, Les, don't worry.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be out of work, but
Can I hold you there for
Yeah.
a second? Because you touched on a really important point.
Yeah.
I'd like to have Amat fill in this blank for us, and that is, what do we see now in terms, what do we see now in terms of government formation taking place? I mean, is this effort to bring ministers back to Aden, is that a genuine government beginning to reemerge? And can it become a government that represents all interests, or is it so tied now to President Hadi and his group that it will never be able to be that functional, kind of wide, overarching, legitimate authority? And maybe we can move on from there to what kind of would look like in the future. Please, Ahmad.
Thank you very much. And needless to say, how happy I am to be here, although the occasion is not so happy, unfortunately, because I hardly can imagine myself that we are entering actually the 7th month of this conflict. It's a very important reminder that it could be dragged on for even more time. I hope not. But it is also very important to start with here, Stephen, by saying that let's remember as well the formation of the government of the so-called National Consensus Government, which was formed immediately after the signature of the GCC initiative. If you recall, it was signed so that both parties to the conflict, those who were sitting on the side of former President Saleh and those who were sitting with the side of the revolutionary youth and the other allies who went with them to the square change, and you know the rest of the story. But even if that government was still divided 50-50 to both parties, it was not effective. It did not do not even 1%, it did not achieve not even 1% of its announced as well program, including, I must say, since we are going to speak very soon as well about the donors and the pledges and the preparation for the reconstructing the Yemen, plus all the other objectives to really achieving peace. Because that government, unfortunately, was first made up of just different political figures. Most of the members of it were the assistant generals of a given political party, at least 2/3 of them, to the extent with the poor prime minister, Mr. Basindwa then, could not even issue any decree, not even in verbum, if you will, let alone his ability to do anything or to instruct his own ministers and his own cabinet. And again, then when we had the government, the current government, which came, of course, after the Houthis made it to Sana'a, and as we recall also, it is composed of technocratic individuals. But it was, of course, wrong timing again, because you were in a very, very political period of time. It was boiling. A new political group has made it all the way from Saada, made it to Sana'a, very openly, very calmly, and then went on to Ta'az, to the south, with every single government office, or let's say even armed forces, police station, giving up and just announcing that they are now, working together as in a brotherly, really, atmosphere. While that was doing, of course, and we remember when the whole government and also when the president were really put under house arrest, but that also again to tell us if truly now the government, which is still the same, it's the same government that was put under the home arrest from the month of November until January, if you recall. It is the same with the exception of 5 ministers. 2 of them are still abducted by the Houthis, Minister of Defense and Minister of Technical Education. And then you have the Minister of Youth, former Minister of Youth, who resigned with the government, and he did not back up like most of the government when they did, because they announced their resignation. But then they decided they were going to go back on it as soon as President Hadi made it to Aden, and then after that made it to Riyadh, and we know the rest of the story. So now in Aden, a few hours ago, President Hadi just made it to Aden, and he has already met, I guess by now, with the cabinet. Hopefully there will be some announcement, not only to send a message of hope, which is mostly needed, and especially to the people who are still striving and struggling under the continued conflict from the sky, also on the ground, within the internal different factions, in most of the governorates of Yemen, by the way. And even in Aden, where we know the security situation hasn't even allowed the Prime Minister and his team to make it all together to Aden. That's why he had now with him only about 11 ministers, and the rest are in different places as well. And I think they will not be able to stay in Aden for a longer time. And of course, if the president is is going to go to the United Nations General Assembly to present Yemen, and also for him to use it as a political as well forum to announce what kind of achievement the coalition and the legitimate government has made. But that means also, as you have been also following, that many people were in protest, including those who participated in the fight against Houthis, including, of course, the national resistance groups, and who have been, of course, demonstrating against the government when it arrived in Aden. And even until yesterday, they almost blocked the motorcade of the prime minister, and they wanted to come into his office. And actually, his office, as you know, and even also the president's office, is being guarded by Emirati forces. So this is how fragile the situation is, but also within that particular context, the government has made it public as well, that they have established two major high commissions. The first one is to do a lot of work on the relief, on the High Commission for Relief, and the other one is for reconstruction and development. And each of these two major and important commissions are presided, and also the vice presidents are all ministers, and they are also representing South-North equation. It's not all from one side, again, for the sensitivity as well of this issue. But whether their plan really to start the rebuilding and the reconstructing of Yemen going to be seen very soon, this is very, very doubtful, actually, a question. And to start with, I wanted just to give you very quick overview on some figures and numbers about, first of all, the government status, talking about budget, talking about the income, talking about the national reserve. And yes, we know the government was divided, and it is still divided. Even if you have a government in Aden, you have a de facto government in Sana'a. And this is not something that for anybody just to go by, because they are still running the show in so many governorates at the same time. While we are talking about the government sitting in Aden, the legitimate government sitting in Aden, you have de facto government which is sitting in Sana'a and running the show, but running it without having any proper institution that is working on any issue that they are announcing to. Hence, the situation is very, very difficult, and we don't know what's going to happen if truly now the talk will become more serious when it comes really to establishing peace and to start talking about peace. As Fatima said, making peace, nobody is making any peace, but a lot of people are talking about peace building. So you can't really build anything before it. So some numbers and figures on that regard. And these numbers are actually taken from my own team at the Executive Bureau. We had our colleagues do it by their personal follow-up with the Central Bank of Yemen, with technical people and staff at the Ministry of Finance. And it is clear that the GDP is now going to be down 43% from last year. This is the general, the gross national product of Yemen. This year, it is expected to reach a low of 43%. So this is very, very difficult situation. The overdraft facility within the Central Bank of Yemen reached more than 1 Yemeni billion riyal. And the government of Yemen needs about 90 billion Yemeni riyals only to pay the monthly salaries of the public employees. 90 billion riyals. That's very important. Then the gross foreign reserves of Central Bank of Yemen at the end of May, this is not in July, not in August, because the situation has even deteriorated. It was 3.417 billion US dollar. That includes, of course, the $1 billion which Saudi Arabia has deposited to support the national reserve. In that regard as well, I would like to give you some information on the increase again of the, actually the shrinking of the government share of oil export. It really declined very much from US dollar $322 million during April and May in 2014, this is last year, to about 0.1 million during the same period of 2015, which means currently it's almost at no production level. And especially now with the increase also of the violence in Maghreb, mostly there, and also AQIP sitting in Al-Mukalla and in different places, close even to the oil wells, as you know. And this is another issue. Nobody talks about it right now. But it is the most also dire situation when it comes not just to the government, but also to the people, to the population of the areas where these groups are really managing and directing really the show. And also the direct impact. It is very important really for us to remember that the United Nations, again, are saying clearly, until August of this year, like until last month, you had almost 1.5 million internally displaced Yemenis. This is inside Yemen, and you can imagine what's happening to them. And every day, every other day, we hear about some strikes also impacting and killing some of those IDPs, whether it's in the north, in the west of the country, or in the middle, or at anywhere else. And then you have also about 5,000 deaths actually recorded until August. And in addition, and I think this is very underestimated number. To me, if I'm just going to relay on some messages that I receive from families and friends inside Yemen, the number of those who have been killed is just unbelievably high. But until now, of course, we don't have even any numbers, of course, and this is only regarding the civilians. We're not talking about the armed elements. We're not talking about the army. We're not talking about anybody who's carrying arms with any party inside that conflict, and I'm sure it will be very disastrous and very, very difficult. In addition to that, about 2,300 civilian infrastructures, such as schools, hospitals, markets, all destroyed or partially damaged. This is really huge. I mean, for all of us who know Yemen and who know the level and the status of development of Yemen, this is by all means is going to take Yemen back like centuries when it comes really to the infrastructure. And that will cost as well, according to one of the ministers I spoke to yesterday, actually hundreds of billions of dollars, if really for us to rebuild whatever has been destroyed. So the cost, of course, of the war is also high, as you know. We're hearing about billions of dollars paid for rockets, for bombs, for planes, for pilots, for armed vehicles, for ground troops, etc. But of course, the cost for really finishing and completing and stopping the war would be even more costly. And that has to be really addressed, and especially in view of the regional involvement and also the international involvement, and especially, hopefully not, that maybe the Western typical donors will go and say, this is an Arab conflict, and if the Gulf really has been part of it, then they should really do what they have to do in order really to remedy this and to correct it. So it's going to be really, really difficult. And of course, what we don't see immediately when we speak about the losses of war is the fact that also we don't see how many students were really prevented from completing their year school last year. We have no less than 3 million students who could not really finish even their exams. When the Houthis, especially in the northern governorates, tried really to make it happen regardless of all the violent atmospheres, only 56% of the students really were able to go to the final exam, the final year exam of the high school students, which is really terrible because, you know, the level of education of Yemen in Yemen is so low by itself. And this is part of the failure of all the regimes that took place in Yemen, north and south, in my opinion, from even 1962. Because nobody, no particular political regime was capable of truly tackling those major issues which are underdevelopment issues, more than any other political issues that the political elite continues actually to use even foreign interventions to really justify it, because they failed miserably to do anything when it comes to really fulfilling the national obligations.
All right, I'm going to hold you there for a second because what you're talking about is an important element, and it goes back to earlier comments about how this culture of cohesion, this culture of inclusion that you've all mentioned in Yemen, where people do get along, whether or not the divisions and the sectarian divisions are not historically apart, how does that, at this point, suffer from the current divides? And even you mentioned yourself, the government now is something maybe as north and south. Les talked about forming a government of competencies, a technocratic government. Let me ask Fatima, do you think, Fatima, there is an opportunity here to actually form a government that would include the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islah Party, the GPC, even the Houthis who need to come into this, because as Amat notes, they have a very important stake. They still control the capital Sana'a. How do we overcome these in a post-conflict scenario and invite all of these disparate groups to become Yemeni in some common sense again?
So 7 months ago, this wouldn't have been the question because they were already working together. So we're going backwards, and things are unpredictable right now because all of the groups have actually been violent with each other. So I can't necessarily imagine what the trajectories are going to be. But I can tell you, I mean, there is a culture of mediation in Yemen. I think this is one of the good things in the Yemeni society. So social cohesion is strong. There's a culture of empathy, recognizing suffering. Yemenis will help each other. No one is going to stop helping somebody else because, you know, they are Shia or they're Sunni or what have you. That's just not going to happen. However, the Houthis have committed egregious violations in the south of Yemen. I know I have family there that has been affected and are now in exile. And people who are supporting the current coalition are not being seen in favorable light as well. Even if you're an independent person and you have no stake in any party, just the fact that you've lost, you know, somebody close to you because they were just caught on the ceasefire, you were there at the wrong place at the wrong time. That just doesn't bode well. It doesn't make supporting this initiative good. So, one of the devastating things, and that comes as a result of the current intervention, is that it removed power from civil society groups. It removed it from people like us. And I have a civil society organization in Yemen, but what voice do we have? Because it's all about geopolitics at the moment. So, you know, and not only, I mean, just to echo back on that comment of the woman saying, you know, like she doesn't know about the Shia mosque and etc. We don't either. So we haven't really experienced that. But now people, I feel like the closest analogy I could think about is sort of like what happened in Lebanon, where, you know, after this civil war in Lebanon, people became more politically aware of their situation. And, you know, you talk to Lebanese and it's always about some kind of a political agenda. You know, they always carry that. And I'm starting to see that in Yemen. I'm starting to see it on Facebook, social media, that, you know, a critique on the Houthis, a critique on the Salafis, a critique on the, you know, Islahis, etc. So this is problematic. The other thing that I worry about, and I'll come back to this because this is really what is threatening. I have faith that the society will solve its problem as long as it just remains a Yemeni thing. Yemenis also welcome mediation. We welcome outside. I mean, Les is more Yemeni than I am, I guess, in some ways, because he sat there and mediated, like, you know, political debates and you know. So this is very important. It's there in our culture. We're receptive to it, but what I worry about is a foreign intervention, such as, you know, again, military foreign intervention. It does something to the society. It changes the way that the society even relates to each other, because you start thinking about, I mean, there's an entire aspect of injustice that we're not talking about clearly or transparently. So it's starting with the drones, I have to say. So the drones is also one aspect. I mean, the drone has created many devastating aspects in many areas and allowed for the terrorist groups to thrive in some areas as well. So I can't even imagine what this intervention would allow. These are my concerns. Is there going to be a culture of peace? Yes, but then we need political leadership, which is not there. I'm afraid to say that President Hadi has lost his legitimacy. I mean, he could not provide safety, stability, security for the Yemeni people. So I don't think he should continue in his position. I think there would be no receptivity for his role.
All right, Fatima, let me hold you
but
there
yeah.
because I want to invite Les to come back in because you've talked about the difficulty in trying to get this reconciliation begun. And I want to ask Les, as a practical matter, given your experience in that of NDI, do you think you can imagine or envision a mechanism that might be useful in this reconciliation process? And would it look like the National Dialogue Conference? I hesitate to use a name, but is that something that you might want to recreate in another form under another name?
Yeah, I think you probably have to do something like that. I mean, several of us now have mentioned Lebanon, and you know, one of the scenarios, but I think it's a negative scenario, is a Lebanese-style scenario where you know, you sort of there's a kind of a balance of terror in a sense. You know, every group, the groups that you decide have a stake in this, you know, they get something. You know, whether it's Iraq or the Houthis get the north, you know, the Islah gets a chunk, and the former GPC and the GPC and their allies get a chunk or something. But the problem with that scenario is that it does just lead to complete gridlock. I mean, it doesn't lead to governance. It could easily lead to people arming themselves. It could lead to civil war, further civil war. It could lead to, you know, all sorts of demarcations, regional and tribal demarcations, and so on. But I'm a little bit afraid that that's kind of one of the scenarios. A more hopeful scenario, which is still very much a Yemeni scenario, would be the idea of two separate governments being stitched together, probably by Hadi as more of a symbolic figure. I mean, I think probably most people thinking about Yemen, they may not think that Hadi is finished particularly, but they may think he's finished as a day-to-day figure, that he may be simply, you know, he still represents perhaps the most legitimate figure we have, but that, you know, that he's a symbolic figure. Baha is more of a day-to-day figure, and then you have some kind of national dialogue process that, you know, kind of stitches it all together. So you know, Baha is running this day-to-day. Perhaps Hadi, you know, presides over, or at least symbolically presides over, again, a grand negotiation of some sort. But I would worry about that too because of, you know, not that I put too much stock in 4 focus groups, but I think the people made an interesting comment, which is that the people that participated in the last dialogue are now fighting. There wasn't enough to hold it together. The guarantees of the international community weren't there. I think the third scenario, which I think would be more likely to work, but perhaps less likely to happen, but again, talking to Yemenis in Beirut, including very highly, you know, sort of former president of South Yemen for one, and then some others, they're very interested in some sort of internationally guaranteed process. I mean, I think that they would accept, a lot of people would accept if it were on offer, you know, I don't know what the terminology is anymore, a peacekeeping force or some sort of observation force, backed by powerful countries, not necessarily a KSA organized thing, which I think is they're a little too compromised in this, but I mean, internationally backed. And I think, you know, I'll defer to my Yemeni friends, but I think that there probably, some people would resist it, but there's probably something there. Certainly, I think everyone believes that whatever negotiation process goes forward, that just a mediated process with a relatively medium-level UN bureaucrat's not going to do the job. It's going to have to be something backed by, you know, something more Bosnia-like, where NATO came in. Not saying it's going to be NATO, obviously, but you know, I mean, first in Bosnia. But if everyone remembers, the big, you know, artillery rolled in, and then the parties were brought together. So something along that line.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. I want to bring in Ahmad now. Given your experience at the UN and also at the Executive Secretariat in Yemen, how do you see something on the ground forming that is going to allow the international community to feel as though it can mobilize resources, deploy them in Yemen in a way that's effective, will be fully monitored, and will reach the actual recipients? And how would you imagine that would look?
All the above, which was mentioned by Steve, will not happen or take place unless there is peace. There is at least an announcement, a serious engagement and belief on the end to this terrible war. Because there's no way that you could talk about the next stage of rebuilding, reconstructing, national reconciliation, while you are still, suffering from a full-fledged war. This is the first war that the entire Yemen is becoming an open space to it. I don't recall in the previous history, in recent, at any other time. This is truly the first time when the entire Yemen territory is witnessing a form of war. Internally, from outside, it's becoming, of course, regionally, definitely now championed, unfortunately, in that regard, fully. And also for the unfortunate luck of the Yemen government, or even for the Houthis, all the parties to that war, the matter is not in their hands. It is not, unfortunately, in their hands anymore. And it is clear, even from the beginning of the announcement of the first Geneva talk, to the second one, to the very latest one, to the current backdoor kind of talk that is taking place in Muscat in Oman, or the other conversation which took place in Egypt, because it's not anymore a Yemeni matter. And that has to be taken in consideration before we think about the next step. So what is it that we can do? Of course, there is still around those who are whether sitting in Riyadh or sitting now in Marib or in parts of the different liberated governorates or territories in Yemen, it is very important for them to think as well that it is not possible for them to continue to rule and to ruin Yemen and then to be rewarded and to become also the next coming and benefiting from any national reconciliation process. Because what has happened, and you recall as well, Liz, in the national dialogue, talking about the transitional justice and forgetting that the GCC initiative itself gave a full immunity for the former president, and at the same time did not see it like something wrong if he was also still acting as the president of the GPC. So all these things do not really help in paving the way for that. But in addition to that, I think it will have to be a genuine process. I do not think it is possible to repeat the national dialogue, process, which we have lived with it for more than 10 months. It had so many flaws again, flaws that were committed by Yemen, by the regional actors, and by the international community. So if these three actors will be able to wake up and to say, the issue of Yemen is so dangerous that it is not possible to keep dealing with it as if nothing happened. Thousands of people have paid from their lives. Thousands of houses have been destroyed. Privately owned entities have been destroyed. Nobody can bring not even an aspirin, let alone, medications for, diabetics, other diseases, etc. People are dying in Yemen because also there is no hospital, not anymore, not even in the capital or any other governorate of Yemen for that matter. And let's also remember that we have almost 28 million people. And no matter how big the fighting forces are, under the wings of the coalition or under the wings of the Houthis and the former president forces, the vast majority of Yemenis are paying very expensive price for nothing that they have done. They haven't done anything. They are not part to it. They don't want to, except that now they are being divided in a sectarian way, whether we like it or not. People are now talking about the lower Yemen, the upper Yemen, the Shia, the Zaydi, the Sunni, Shafi'i, and all other unbelievable as well descriptions of divide that is happening. And this morning, the Socialist Party, finally, I think they woke up, and they sent a very interesting letter saying that, well, now since there is a talk about national reconciliation, we warn of the repetition of the national, we are warning against the exclusion of any political party. And I think they were referring as well not to, of course, exclude the Houthis, because you want to speak about the elephant in the room. You can't just imagine after you destroyed Yemen entirely, you can't imagine or can't explain to people and tell them, we're fighting nobody. You are talking about the Houthis, who have been really part of the integral issue, which was also the failure of the Yemeni political system, unfortunately, to run the transition properly. And part of their failure, by the way, Steve, was also in the matter of benefiting from more than $11 billion that was pledged in the years of 2012 in Riyadh, also in New York. And then after that, if you recall, when President Hadi paid a very urgent visit to Saudi Arabia during late King Abdullah, who also immediately gave Yemen $3 billion after the announcement of the lifting of the subsidies. With all of that, unfortunately, there was not any possibility really to benefit from all that money. And to go back to your talk as well about the possibility of investing on the donors' money, it is still there. And the government, according to what I heard from them, they are planning and they have already asked the Gulf countries in particular to bring about and to transfer the money that were allocated, the money which were allocated as part of the loans to the Yemen government, especially from regional donors, including the governments and also the financial regional institution, so that the government can use it in the immediate investment on the so-called immediate, relief of issues, and then to prepare as well for the reconstruction. But definitely you need a political ground, a ground that is surrounded and protected really by also the will of the majority of the Yemenis. It's very important to talk about the non-exclusion, because we have to learn all the time, when you exclude even a minor political faction, then you pay for it at a later stage with more damage, unfortunately. And of course, it is part or one of the vices of the Yemeni political life, like it is in so many countries. But it is possible really still, if we have serious commitment by a serious leadership that wants really to heal the wounds. The civil war, as we know, takes sometimes, of course, easier months maybe to wage it, but it takes sometimes really decades to try and solve it and find some answers to it.
All right, great.
That's very important.
I think this is a wonderful place to pause because we have a lot of interesting issues still on the table, and I'd like to pursue my conversation here, but I want to invite people who are with us today to join it. And I think that we may have some questions, and if you do have a question, there's microphones out there circulating. Please identify yourself in the process of asking the question. And if you want to direct it to one of our panelists, please do that as well. Otherwise, we will decide among ourselves who provides the answer. Any questions?
Thank you. Actually, I have two questions.
Identify yourself, please.
Abdelhakim Al-Ariani.
Thank you so much.
One for Ms. Asrar. She talked about the multiple conflicts, actually. And do you think that if the dust ever settles, that the picture would still be the same, so we can plan for the when the peace comes? Because I think that there are new elements and new factions emerging as this war is going on, and we have to take this in consideration. So I would like to hear your take on this. And my second question is for Ms. Alsoswa. It's about, you mentioned the pledges of the donors, 2012 and even before that in the London conference. And there has been always a question that Yemen is not capable of absorbing the aid. And this was when we still had, quote unquote, a government. And so how do you think the situation would be if this conflict comes to an end, with all government institutions almost non-existent? And since you're heading the office concerned with this particular issue.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with Fatima, and if you would please, the issue of are conflicts in Yemen changing, and is that making it more complicated and more difficult and more intractable?
Right, thank you. So I didn't mean to just abbreviate it into 3 layers of conflict. Sort of just wanted to give a simple structure of what is going on, what has been in Yemen for the past maybe 50 years, and I can't even imagine what types of conflict are going to occur as a result of this. So during the Saleh regime, what President Saleh did, the former president, is that he somewhat kept the lid on of all of these conflicts, just by suppression, repression. These things do not matter. So just, kept, paying here, paying this tribe off, etc. So it all worked itself out. When he was removed, everything, just all the problems came out. But I agree with you. It's not just confined in these conflicts. I keep thinking about the region, what happened in Syria and Iraq, and the groups that just find ways of adapting to local circumstances and what they look like. Not even going that far, but if you think about the situation just in south of Yemen, where I was there a couple of years ago, there are drug lords that we haven't even heard about. They're not even reported in the news, but drug lords all over the area selling, narcotics, and no one knows about a drug problem in Yemen. So the issues are too many. They're devastating, but at the same time, I am hopeful that when peace is there, and if there is commitment from the international community, that some work could happen in terms of securing a better environment in at least in the urban environments. But I don't think we can tackle everything. Again, international organizations have said it's not enough. If the private sector cannot come in, if you give all the aid that you request, if it's all fulfilled, you still need the private sectors to come in, and a sense of safety and security and stability for things to happen. Currently, people, even if you have money, you can't buy food because there is no food, and that the water prices are way high. So I don't know how people can live, or and it's a problem actually in urban areas more than rural areas. In rural areas, people can bring one Bowser and it will last them for 3 months. But in urban areas, it's not the same way. So I think we're going to see more conflicts. So I agree with you. We have to be just a bit more prepared.
No, and I think your point is well taken about the need to create then the absorptive capacity that I hope Amat will now discuss in order to be able to kind of eliminate some of these conflicts and some of these issues that you just described in pricing and unavailability of resources.
I think we can all start from the point that, of course, we need to think differently. At least, I don't think there is a possibility of repeating the very recent past's mistakes, including that very centralized thinking when it comes to the disbursement of the development funds or projects for that matter, because throughout, even from the beginning of the 70s, when the whole notion of the central development started, if you remember Dr. Abdul Karim's establishing the Central Bureau for planning, it was based on the idea that in order to increase the ability of the government and of the states really to control economically and to help economically the most also remote areas, to spread the projects of developments to all those needy. With that whole notion, of course, that was during the time when Yemen was still one. It was the north, remember? In the south, they had their own as well way of more even centralized, if you will, thinking when it comes to the states only taking care of a one-line kind of economic provider to start with, and also the services were run by the government, etc., with the nationalization, etc. In the aftermath, if you will, after 1994 in particular, not after the unity of 1990, because it was then that when the Southern Army, and I'm sorry to speak again about arms and armies and military, etc., but that was really a very important point, because it was when the Northern as well Army, even if it was headed by the then Minister of Defense, who's the current president, by the way, Mr. Abdurrabbu Hadi, he was the Minister of Defense during the war in the South in 1994. But if you recall, after that, there was not any serious attempt to change the mentality, the political mentality, in the direction of the support of the services, let alone, in the safeguard of the whole nation and the question of sovereignty, and relying as well on the Southerners as full citizens, as people who also have the same guts and the same feeling about their own home as well. And it all started there because whatever happened after 1994, the South did not see itself. Unfortunately, that was true to a great extent in any of those projects or programs, including development too. And it started with that. But then it became, after 2011, when the same prescription was given to that sick man, which was Yemen in that regard, the entire Yemen, post Ali Abdullah Saleh. And they did the same after they held, the 2006, 2012, 2014 even, Friends of Yemen conferences and pledges, etc. Again, even with the new mechanism that they have invented whereby they divided different groups inside Friends of Yemen, but it was to me very formal, very superficial even. I'm sorry to say that now, it must be shocking, but I have said that even to the people, the ambassadors even of those countries who were sitting in those commissions, because it gave them, of course, the ability not only to monitor, but also to attend and perhaps also to give sometimes references as to how the government should really invest in where, etc. It was to that extent of really becoming part of this national development issue. But to me, it was still not so effective because even at the level of the ambassadors' engagements or the different groups which were formed around the Friends of Yemen, different groups, the problem was lying actually inside the Yemeni governmental structure, which was not ideal. Actually, not only that, it was not ideal. It was not ready. Most of the time, it was incapable. Most of the time, there was a lot of nepotism, even in naming people and officials. Plus, we had a very serious of corruption. And this is, of course, not to say that everything that we received was ready, because throughout a year, when I took office in the Executive Bureau, it took us sometimes a whole year, seriously, to get a project of $5 million implemented because of the bureaucracy in some donors' countries too. So that added as well to the inability of the government really to invest and to benefit from those, donations, which are really huge. You have really more than $11 billion. And when you talk about them, you can't believe yourself. If you have all this money sitting there, it's a crime that the Yemeni people who are not now capable of even surviving, not to get to benefit from that too. But of course now, after the war, you have to first start with a peace conference, whatever you name it. It is necessary that you have to include everyone, and that includes the groups that you refer to, because truly it's not only the national resistance movement that also appeared and very strongly, and they are calling actually even and taking it to the streets already and protesting in front of the government in Aden in the whole last week, because they do not only want the salaries to be paid with. I am sure very soon, of course, as you know, in the south as well, the southern Iraq is so adamant, and today they received the president with the former flag, southern Yemeni flag. This is a very serious matter, and it's not going to be dealt with this time with lots of rhetoric or political blah, 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 and lip services. People are going to need that. So it's very important now to have a combination of international, regional, and local partners. In the local partners scheme, if you will, you need to have the private sector, you need to have civil society organizations, and by the way, they are all ready and more than capable. If there is anybody who's more ready really to participate in the dispersion and to participate really in supporting their country, it is the private sector and it is also the civil society organizations, and nobody can say that they are not capable or they are not qualified, because they are. It's just the change of the mentality of the government in that regard.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question up here, do we still? And then we'll go back towards the rear, please, Dalal.
Thank you for a very informative panel for Fatima, Amatullah, and Leslie. My name is Hala, I'm from Saudi Arabia, and one thing that always comes up is that the role of Saudi-led coalition is to give peace a chance, basically curb the Houthis' armed conflicts so that other actors in the region can build up peace or civilization or build up a good governance, which is, of course, I know it's not valid argument. So I think from what you've said, I gather that the first step in establishing peace is to stop the war.
Yep.
So I understand that there is a lot of efforts on the civil society to build a coalition to support the funds necessary for bringing up whatever has been lost during the past few months or before. But what can be done to stop the armed conflict? What can be stopped to pressure the Saudi-led coalition to stop the war? Since the Houthis are not going to stop, since every attempt to curb the Houthis will be giving Houthis more grounds for continuing the war.
Yeah, let me just ask Les if he has a view on this, given the conversations you had or your people had with the Yemeni focus groups. They talked about the fact that what Saudi was doing was a necessary evil. I mean, it was bad, but what was worse was what the Houthis had done. Do you see that there's some way now to bring the Saudis in a constructive way, given what they've done, to serve a role in this post-conflict scenario?
Yeah, I think it should happen, at least in theory. I was actually going to ask Amat to expand on what she was saying about every time, we get close to it seems like there's going to be a real ceasefire and some kind of negotiation. It doesn't happen, and I don't understand why it doesn't happen, but I see it's not happening, and I think you're hinting at reasons. Just looking at it from afar, it seems that the outside forces have something to do with it. I mean, it seems as if I don't really know. I don't. It's all conjecture. I mean, why? It does seem, because again, we've had reporting from our staff, and they're staying in touch with various people, including Hadi and his son and others, and it will seem, and everyone will think that the peace talks are imminent. Yes, tomorrow, it'll happen, and then it doesn't happen, and I don't really know exactly why. So maybe someone else wants to comment on that. In theory, I think Saudi Arabia and its allies in this could and should play a very constructive role. I mean, the money is there, the pledges are there. They should be willing to work with a Yemeni government that's stood up. We have talked a little bit at this meeting, but I know there are other discussions about what exactly which Yemeni-led ministry or relatively independent kind of sub corporation of a ministry would manage reconstruction and so on. One concern, I think, though, that I have, and we discussed this briefly just before this meeting started, is that it's interesting to see Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries so involved in something like this, and there's very little experience. And whereas there are many other countries, primarily Western countries, not exclusively, but primarily Western countries, that have intervened in the recent past in conflicts. And I can think of a few examples. Cambodia was one where there was a UN-led process to kind of bring Cambodia out of the darkness of their problems. Bosnia is another obvious one from the 90s. There have been several in Africa. But when there have been interventions of, especially military interventions or other interventions, then the country doing the intervening, or the countries doing the intervening, then have to cooperate. It seems to me, they then sort of have to give up some of their power. It's hard for them to do. It's been hard for the U.S. to do that. After the Iraq War, for example, to rebuild Iraq. The U.S. at first really bridled at having to cooperate with Iran. It's taken many, 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 many years for the U.S. to start to realize that whether it liked it or not, Iran was going to play a role in Iraq, for example, or that that the U.S. couldn't control everything that came out of the UN, that it was going to have to accept getting maybe blasted once in a while. And I think that Saudi Arabia is going to have to find a way now to cooperate within the international system, and it's going to be uncomfortable. They're going to have to accept conditions, their funding is going to be used in ways that they may not like. they're going to get criticized a lot. And it's going to feel very nasty because I think that Saudis and Emiratis and others are going to feel justifiably that they've spent money and lost lives and sacrificed a lot to, quote, help a country, but believe me, they won't get a lot of thanks, you know. But to me, maybe that's simplifying it, but to me, it's almost like you want to say, welcome to the rest of the world. That's how it works.
Yeah.
You know, you don't get a lot of thanks, especially when you're perceived as a bit of a superpower, and Saudi Arabia is a superpower within its own region, its own realm. So I think the answer is yes, and I think that most people would welcome a Saudi Arabia that now was able to step back, use the resources it has to to participate and cooperate, but was willing to to take a secondary role. And it may, for example, have to come into various fora around the international fora with countries it doesn't particularly like, and it's going to have to send diplomats to meetings and all that kind of stuff. So it'd be interesting to see that process happen.
We're running out of time, and I saw another hand in the back, so I'm trying to get one more question in here. Hussein, please.
So, I'm Hussein Ibish. I'm a senior resident scholar here at the Institute. We've seen other instances in the Arab world, thinking of Gaza and Lebanon, where post-conflict reconstruction has tended to reinforce, if not institutionalize, let's say, fiefdoms within a country, a state disintegration, and where local groups have managed reconstruct, Hezbollah, for example, or Hamas, rather than the internationally recognized authorities like the Lebanese government or the PA, and there are others in Lebanon who've done this. So the question is, what can, and I mean, I think actually expecting groups inside Yemen, including whatever government there is at the time, to avoid this might be asking a little much, especially if there isn't full national reintegration at that stage, which there probably wouldn't be. So what could the donor community do to try to ensure that the process of reconstruction and funding reconstruction doesn't reinforce a national disintegration or national fragmentation? Yeah?
Gotcha.
Thanks.
Amat, you want to give this a try?
Well, that's very easy. It's nothing, I can just say a few words. No, Hussein, you are right in referring to these immediate neighboring examples. We're not far from Gaza or Lebanon. Actually, the situation in Yemen is more complex. It is by far complex. If you look at the composition of the Yemeni society, there is no other way but to co-opt and to coexist and to accept each other's differences. And that we did for thousands of years. I mean, unfortunately, the current political agitation and the war, especially the current war, since now there is a composition as well and a combination of regional, local, perhaps also international, as you know, and each party has its own take and interest too. This is why this situation sounds now almost impossible to sort, and that's why we say, since it is that complex, then the same actors who have been adding to the fuel, adding the fuel to the fire, they should be the ones as well who are trying to help. And through that, I must also say and refer to what Liz was saying in regards to the role of the international community. Actually, we have seen so many international actors dropping the ball. And it was clear by the minute or by the day when the embassies were closing and everything was so fast, and then everybody moving to Riyadh, the complexity then started even from that day, because it was impossible. If you are sitting there and then this particular country is engaging in a different way on the country that you were at, it is impossible. What can you do if you are sitting there? I understand the security concern. I understand what has happened so that the international community really just made it so fast and they left the country in less than 3 days altogether. But then from that day, it was clear that the Yemeni people will be left in the places where also those armed groups, and I call them armed groups, wherever they were, under any coverage, they started, to really rebuilding their existence and for their existence to become more rooted really to it. And it's really impossible to see big international actors, including the P5, who have been very active, maybe too much active in the previous stage during the first transition. And it is very, of course, we understand, and we have also to refer to the new regional development. This is also the nuclear agreement between the West and Iran that has fueled and led immediately, in my opinion, to the agitation of the situation, especially when the Houthis also made it so clear and they became so proud to announce that they were ready and they have started military exercise close to the borders of Saudi Arabia. And at the same time, they were so daring to just go all the way, and perhaps as well under the terrible and ill advice of former President Saleh to start really air attacking, the office of President Hadi in Aden. All that, of course, was taking place, unfortunately, when there was nobody to witness that or to do anything to stop, maybe to start curbing that. And then after that, we recall as well the full engagement of the entire GCC countries with the exception of Oman. And I don't see why not as well, through as well the encouragement to the Omani authorities to play even a major role. Forget about what one can read in the newspapers about the agitation and the feeling that the Saudis don't like. I don't think they will mind, or they don't want to see some kind of support really to resolving this issue. We know, of course, Saudi Arabia and Emirates and the others who are participating in the coalition, by no means you can compare them to the situation of Yemen. No way, under any circumstances. And do not forget as well, now we are talking as well about a situation, if peace is going to be initiated, there will be no national army of Yemen. You will have only a bunch of groups who have been armed, either by the coalition or by the support of former president and Houthis, but there isn't any core of something called national army. And that actually led to the current situation, because it was also another failure of the transitional government and of the current government, I must say as well, because there wasn't a serious take on that matter. And they were just happy to rename some of the generals or commanders based on their as well personal affiliation to the current president, in comparison to the same thing which was done by the former president when he named his members, his family members, or when he was naming people from his own clan just to guarantee their personal loyalty. But the question of a national army is of a major concern. And
I'm going to stop you right there. Because you know what,
especially
Ahmad,
now-
if we start on demilitarization and a national, we'll be here for another hour. Okay, last word.
But now you have at least 500,000 armed person, either at the side of President Saleh and Houthis or at the side of the so-called national resistance movement. Who is going to do anything about them? And you can't even find one concrete list of any unit, let alone a whole army. This is a grave thing, and it's very, very important to look at that when we speak about peace and re-establishing peace, because you need a guarantor.
You certainly do. And I think that issue, we may take it up at a future session, because it is crucially important to the stability of Yemen, all countries coming out of a post-conflict scenario. I want to thank my guests, all three of you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Look forward to seeing you again.